There's a head housekeeper in a mansion in Gangnam who has been hiding a secret for exactly 1,460 days. That's 4 years. 4 years of watching her boss, the most dangerous man in the city, walk right past his own children without ever knowing they were his. 4 years of staying invisible. But today, the secret has finally run out of time. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Now let's get into it. Think about this for a moment. While Kang Dae-hyun was busy building his empire and acting like he owned the world, he believed he had erased his past. He thought he had gotten rid of a girl named Senna to protect his throne. But here's the part that really stays with you. While he was upstairs in his penthouse feeling untouchable, Senna was still there. She never left. She was downstairs in a cleaning uniform, scrubbing the same floors he walked on every day. And she wasn't alone. She was raising twins, his twins, on whatever little she could manage, hoping he would never look closely enough to recognize his own eyes in them. Now, if you know how Dae-hyun operates, you know he believes he can fix anything with money or violence. He thinks because he's the boss, he can simply show up and claim a family he never built. But what he, and the rest of the world, don't realize yet is that something is coming that his power can't stop. There are black cars waiting near his property that don't belong to him. There's a legal file sitting somewhere that could take those children away in just 48 hours. And the hardest part of all? The one who will step in to protect those kids isn't the man with all the power. It's the woman with the mop, along with a quiet group of invisible workers who have been protecting his legacy while he was busy being a legend. The gold elevator doors slid open quietly, but Kang Dae-hyun didn't move, his hand still hovering near the scanner as something felt off. Sitting on the floor inside was a small boy, no older than 4, wearing a crooked plastic crown and playing with a worn-out toy car while humming a lullaby Dae-hyun hadn't heard in 4 years. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice colder than he meant, but the boy simply looked up without fear, his dark eyes mirroring Dae-hyun's so closely it felt like staring at himself. "I'm waiting for the magic lady," the child said softly, pointing toward the basement button, and before Dae-hyun could make sense of it, the doors began to close. He quickly stopped them and stepped inside, his heart suddenly pounding as the elevator descended to the service floor, a place he never visited. When the doors opened, a woman in a faded cleaning uniform reached for the boy. "Minho, I told you to stay by the—" she began, then froze as she looked up. "Dae-hyun," she whispered, like a ghost from the past. He looked from her worn-out shoes to the boy clinging to her, then noticed another child hiding behind her, a girl, a twin with the same eyes. In that moment, everything he thought he had erased came crashing back, and he realized that for 4 years, while he believed he was building his empire alone, his real life had been right there beneath him, and the one thing he could never take back was the time he had already lost. Dae-hyun stepped out of the elevator, and the luxury of the upper floors felt like a distant, shallow dream compared to the heavy, damp air of the service basement. Here, he didn't look like a king. He looked like an intruder. Senna didn't flinch. She stood her ground, one hand resting protectively on Minho's shoulder, while the little girl, Haun, gripped the fabric of her uniform tightly. "How?" Dae-hyun's voice was jagged, raw. "How did you get past my security? How did you live under my roof for months without a single sensor tripping?" Senna gave a small, weary smile, the kind that comes from carrying a truth so deep it becomes a weapon. She didn't look at his expensive watch or his cold, sharp eyes. She looked at her own red, chapped knuckles. "You built a fortress of steel and cameras, Dae-hyun, but you forgot one thing," she said. "You forgot to look at the people who make your bed. You forgot the people who scrub the blood off your shirts and carry your trash to the curb." She began to walk down the narrow hallway, her footsteps quiet, ghost-like, in the shadows of her own domain. "For 4 years, you were a legend in the newspapers. But to the women who work here, you were just a man who didn't notice when his coffee was 5 degrees too cold. I didn't need to get past your security. I just needed to wear this gray dress. In your world, a woman with a mop is invisible. I am part of the architecture, just like the pipes and the wiring." She led him to a small, cramped room tucked behind the industrial boilers. The air smelled faintly of dried lavender and cheap baby powder. 2 small cots sat against the walls, a single hot plate hummed quietly, and a stack of well-worn children's books leaned against the corner. "I survived your silence, because the people you ignore chose to hear me," she whispered, her voice gaining a sharp, rhythmic edge. "The drivers gave me their extra rations. The receptionists flagged your schedule, so I knew which hallways to avoid. We created our own syndicate while you were busy playing God." Dae-hyun's eyes fell on the hand-drawn pictures taped to the concrete wall, crude crayon sketches of a family that didn't include him. He realized then that his audit of life had been incomplete. He had counted every dollar, every bullet, every detail, but he had missed the souls living in the cracks of his empire. "You abandoned us for power," Senna said, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were unyielding, hard as diamonds. "But while you were sitting on your throne, we were building a home in your shadows. You aren't finding us, Dae-hyun. We are allowing you to see us. And that is a very different thing." The silence in the boiler room was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of steam and the distant hum of the mansion's elevator. Dae-hyun stood in the center of the cramped space, his presence far too large for the concrete walls, staring first at the two small cots and then at Senna, his jaw tight with a mix of possessive fury and an unfamiliar, gnawing guilt. "This ends now," he said, his voice regaining the sharp, commanding edge that had made him the most feared man in Gangnam. "I'm not leaving my blood in a basement. You have 48 hours to pack their things. I'm moving all of you to the penthouse. There will be doctors, tutors, and a security detail that actually does its job." He waited for gratitude, or perhaps fear, the usual responses to his decrees. Instead, Senna reached into a bucket near the door and pulled out a heavy, damp industrial mop, dropping it at his feet with a dull, wet thud. "You're still thinking in territories and assets, Dae-hyun," she said quietly, stepping over the mop to face him. "You think because you own the deed to this building, you own the people inside it. But you haven't been a father for 1,460 days. You don't get to skip the climb just because you own the mountain." From her apron pocket, she produced a folded piece of yellow notebook paper, worn at the edges, and held it out to him. It wasn't a list of demands for jewelry or silence. It was a handwritten grid titled Father's Rules. "If you want them in the penthouse in 48 hours, you start here," she whispered. "Rule 1. You arrive at 5:30 a.m. to help Min-ho through his night terrors. Rule 2. You learn the difference between a hungry cry and a lonely one. Rule 3. You apologize to every member of my staff you've walked past without looking at for the last year." Dae-hyun looked down at the mop, then at the paper. The absurdity of the king of Gangnam holding a cleaning tool in one hand and a list of toddler chores in the other would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so high. "You're giving me an ultimatum?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "I'm giving you a chance to be a ghost or a father," Senna replied, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "The elevator goes up, Dae-hyun, but it also goes down. If you can't handle the weight of this mop, you'll never be able to handle the weight of their lives. You have 2 days to prove you're more than just a man who knows how to give orders." She turned her back to tuck a stray hair behind Haun's ear, leaving the most powerful man in the city standing in the shadows of his own basement, holding a list of rules that even his bullets couldn't rewrite. Dae-hyun retreated to his surveillance suite, a high-tech glass box overlooking the city, where 32 monitors flickered with the cold blue light of his security perimeter. He watched his elite guards, men trained in 3 languages and 5 ways to kill, patrolling the iron gates with submachine guns hidden under their Italian wool coats. To the world, it was an impenetrable fortress. To Dae-hyun, staring at the crumpled yellow paper in his palm, it was suddenly a house of cards. He zoomed in on camera 14, the service entrance, expecting a breach, a rival scout, or the thermal signature of an intruder. Instead, he saw a delivery driver handing a crate of organic milk to the backgate sentry. It seemed routine until the driver lingered, leaning in to whisper something. The guard didn't push him away. He nodded, eyes softening as he reached into his pocket and handed the driver a small, hand-knitted pair of wool socks. A chill ran through Dae-hyun, unrelated to the air conditioning. This was the invisible network Senna had warned him about. While his generals counted bullets and checked encrypted frequencies, the people who ran the house were communicating in a language of gestures and small kindnesses. The laundress wasn't just folding shirts. She was checking pockets for clues to his movements. The chef wasn't merely preparing meals. He was interpreting the tone of phone calls, relaying the penthouse's vibe to the basement. Every camera revealed the same story in a new way. The head of his personal detail, the man who had taken a bullet for him in Busan, paused to let a toddler's toy car pass, hiding it behind a heavy floor vase rather than reporting the obstruction, smiling genuinely in a way Dae-hyun hadn't seen on his payroll in years. They weren't just watching the syndicate, they were protecting the children from it, a wall of silent bodies, housekeepers and drivers prioritizing the twins' safety over the boss's secrets. Dae-hyun realized, with a jolt of terror, that he was the only one in the building truly alone. He had cameras, but they had eyes. He had microphones, but they had ears. As the sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, he looked down at Rule 3 on Sena's list, apologized to every member of the staff, and finally understood why. He didn't need to fear an assassin's blade half as much as he needed to fear the silence of the people who held his life in their hands every single morning. The air in the mansion shifted at 4 p.m., not with a siren or shout, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a wooden cane against the marble foyer. The elite guards, men who would normally draw their weapons at the slightest unannounced arrival, stood frozen, bowing so low their foreheads nearly touched their knees. Kang Myung-hwan, founder of the original syndicate and the father Dae-hyun hadn't spoken to in 3 years, stepped into the light. He didn't look like a retired mobster. He looked like a ghost from the past, dressed in a charcoal hanbok, eyes sharp and unforgiving as winter frost. He didn't head to the penthouse or his son's office to discuss territory or war. He walked straight to the service elevator, his cane clicking a steady, terrifying countdown. Dae-hyun intercepted him in the laundry hallway, the scent of industrial bleach colliding with the lingering sandalwood that always trailed his father. "Father," Dae-hyun began, voice tight, "if you're here about the Baekho clan's movements—" "I'm not here for you," Myung-hwan interrupted, his low, gravelly voice silencing the hum of washing machines. He didn't look at his son. His gaze was fixed on the small boiler room door where Sena stood, pale but resolute. From the folds of his silk sleeve, he produced a small laminated card, a private bank seal representing the old guard's untraceable reserves. Passing Dae-hyun as if he were furniture, he stopped before Sena and glanced down at Min-ho and Haun, peeking from behind her skirts. For the first time, Dae-hyun saw his father's iron expression soften, a flicker of something human touching the edges of his mouth. "I've been sending the cranes, haven't I?" Myung-hwan whispered. Dae-hyun's stomach dropped. The paper cranes, the invisible support. It wasn't just the maids and drivers. His own father, the man who had taught him that mercy was weakness, had been the shadow financier of Sena's survival. "I heard the wolves are at the gate," Myung-hwan finally said, turning to Dae-hyun, eyes snapping back to cold flint. "You were so busy becoming a king that you forgot how to be a wall. I'm not here to save your empire, Dae-hyun. I'm here to make sure my grandchildren don't pay for your arrogance." He tapped his cane twice on the concrete floor, a signal, and suddenly the service hallway filled with men Dae-hyun didn't recognize. Veterans, retired soldiers of the old era who owed their lives to his father. They didn't answer to the penthouse. They answered to the man who remembered what family meant. Dae-hyun stood in the shadows of his own home, realizing that in the war to come, he no longer held the cards. He was just a man caught between the woman he abandoned and the father who had already replaced him. The high-voltage perimeter fence didn't scream. It died in a silent, surgical snip. On the penthouse monitors, the elite security feed flickered just long enough for 6 shadows from the Baekho clan to slip past the infrared sensors, moving like smoke, convinced that a mansion full of maids and a distracted boss was an open vault. They didn't come for gold. They came for the twins, leverage that could break Kang Dae-hyun's back forever. But as the lead infiltrator stepped into the darkened service corridor, he didn't find a terrified nanny. He found a floor waxed to a lethal, glass-like finish with industrial-grade silicone, far beyond standard for a home. His tactical boots lost all purchase, and his heavy frame slammed into the wall with a hollow thud that echoed like a gunshot. The parlor tricks began with the precision of a symphony. When the second man reached for the light switch, the circuit didn't fail, it backfired. The invisible network had spent the afternoon rewiring the service wing. Instead of darkness, a blinding 2,000-watt industrial strobe hidden in the laundry chute detonated, searing their retinas, and in the disorienting pulse, the hum of the dryers spiked as heavy metal doors vented a pressurized cloud of caustic bleach steam and powdered lye, prepared by the head laundress an hour prior. It wasn't a gunfight, it was a domestic nightmare. The third infiltrator felt a thin, high-tensile wire snag his throat at chest height, rigged by a window washer who knew every blind spot, and as he choked, a service cart weighted with lead pipes and pushed by a silent janitor collided with his shins. From the boiler room, Sena watched the monitors, her hand steady on a tablet controlling the mansion's internal pressure valves. She wasn't a soldier, but she knew this house better than the man who built it. A final command slammed the heavy fire doors of the service wing shut, locking the blinded, choking intruders in a vacuum of their own making. Dae-hyun arrived at the reinforced glass just as the last Baekho soldier collapsed, subdued not by bullets but by a wet floor sign and a face full of pressurized chemicals. He looked at the invisible network, the cook wielding a heavy iron skillet, the gardener with a sharpened spade, and Senna, eyes fixed on her children. "Your men watch the gates, Dae-hyun," Senna said, voice cold and final over the intercom. "But my people watch the hallways. You think you're the only one who knows how to fight a war? You've been fighting with ego. We've been fighting for their lives." The aftermath of the failed breach didn't spark celebration. It triggered a cold, precise execution of a different kind. While Dae-hyun was still counting the unconscious bodies in his service hallway, Senna was already blocks away under the sterile fluorescent lights of the Seoul family court. She wasn't holding a mop anymore. She held a blue legal folder, and for the first time in 4 years, she wasn't hiding. Dae-hyun arrived in a motorcade of black SUVs, pulse hammering with territorial rage, expecting to find her cornered, perhaps negotiating for the penthouse's safety. Instead, a court officer barred him from the hearing room, indifferent to his syndicate rank or the weight of his name. "You can't go in there, Mr. Kong," the officer said, voice flat. Through the narrow glass slit of the courtroom door, Dae-hyun watched Senna standing before a judge, her voice steady and human, a stark contrast to the whispered violence of his world. She wasn't filing for custody. She was executing a surgical strike on his very existence. Submitting a 90-page dossier, not of his crimes, scrubbed at great cost, but of his legal void, she used his own power against him. By proving that Kang Dae-hyun officially owned nothing, that his assets were hidden behind paper companies and his residence a ghost, she showed the court he was a legal phantom. A man who doesn't exist cannot be a father, and a life of unidentified income streams and high-risk associations is, by definition, a danger to a child. "I am registering them today," her voice drifted through the door, unbreakable. "Not as heirs to a syndicate, but as citizens under the protection of the law. I am requesting a permanent restraining order based on the criminal environment the father has cultivated." Dae-hyun felt the walls of his empire close in. He had spent his life outside the system to avoid prison, only to find that in doing so, he had locked himself out of his children's lives. He was the king of Gangnam, but here, he was a stranger with no standing, watching the judge sign the temporary order, ink sealing a barrier no bullet could pierce. Senna turned, eyes meeting his through the glass. She didn't look triumphant, she looked relieved. She had finally realized that the only way to defeat a man who lives outside the law was to step firmly, loudly, and permanently inside it. The courthouse lights hummed with a cold, clinical indifference as Senna stepped into the corridor, the legal folder clutched to her chest like a shield. Dae-hyun was waiting, not as the looming shadow of a man who owned the city, but by a window, the gray afternoon light catching the sharp lines of a face suddenly worn and exhausted. The silence between them wasn't the tactical quiet of the mansion. It was the hollow stillness of two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon. "You won," Dae-hyun said, his voice stripped of its usual gravelly authority. "The court sees me as a ghost. My name isn't on their birth certificates, and my money can't touch their lives." He reached into his pocket, and Senna flinched, a small, instinctive movement that made his jaw tighten with regret. He didn't pull out a phone or a checkbook. He held a single, tarnished brass key on a simple leather ring, no gold, no electronics, no security. "This isn't to the penthouse," he whispered, looking not at her, but at the key. "It's to a small house in a coastal village, 3 hours from here. Registered in my birth name, the one my mother gave me before I became a king. No cameras. No guards. No syndicate blood on the floorboards." Senna didn't reach for it. "And what does the king of Gangnam want in exchange for a house by the sea?" "Nothing," he said, and for the first time, the words sounded true. "I'm not offering this as the boss. I'm offering it as a man who realized today that his throne is just a very expensive cage. I want you to take them there. I want them to grow up in a place where they don't have to be invisible to stay safe." He stepped closer, placing the key on the wooden bench between them. It looked small, insignificant against the backdrop of the massive courthouse. "I'm not asking to move in. I'm not asking for a second chance I haven't earned. I just want the right to stand at the gate. To be the person who fixes the fence, not the one who brings war to the door." Senna looked at the key, then at the man who had spent 4 years trying to erase her, noticing the slight tremble in his hand, a fracture in the obsidian mask he wore for the world. She didn't say yes, didn't say thank you. She simply picked up the key, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. It was the first time they had touched in 1,460 days, and for that heartbeat, the syndicate didn't exist. There was only a woman who had survived the dark and a man who was finally, painfully, trying to find his way into the light. The blue-black light of 5:38 a.m. wrapped the coastal village in a thick, salted mist. There were no neon signs, no humming servers, no men in suits guarding the property, only the steady pulse of the tide against the rocks and the soft metallic click of a gate being unlatched. Dae-hyun arrived, as he had every morning for the last 30 days, not in a motorcade but in a mud-splattered truck smelling of cedar and hard work, carrying no weapon or briefcase, only a small crate of fresh milk and a bag of charcoal for the water heater. He stepped onto the porch of the small house, moving quietly, respectful of the three people still dreaming behind the wooden door. Inside, the kitchen was already warm. Senna was there, her silhouette framed by the rising steam of a kettle. She didn't turn when he entered, but she didn't stiffen either. The jagged edge of fear that had defined their lives for 4 years was finally dulling, replaced by a fragile, unspoken routine. "The wind is coming from the north today," he said softly, matching the stillness of the house. "I've reinforced the shutter on the children's window. It won't rattle anymore." Senna finally turned, her eyes tracing the new calluses on his hands and the absence of the cold, calculating mask he once wore. She reached for 2 ceramic mugs, beginning the ritual, the 60-40 ratio, 60% tea, 40% hot water, a precise, grounding pattern they had adopted because the old words, love, betrayal, forgiveness, were still too heavy to lift. "Min-ho asked if the man who fixes the fence is coming today," she said, handing him a mug. Her fingers didn't linger, but she didn't pull away when his hand brushed hers. "I'll be at the fence until noon," he replied. "And I'll be back tomorrow at the same time." It wasn't a grand declaration or a cinematic reunion in the rain. It was something harder and more real, the daily act of showing up. Dae-hyun gazed out at the gray horizon, realizing he had traded an empire for this quiet 5:38 a.m. moment. He wasn't a king here, and he wasn't a ghost. He was simply a man who had learned that the only way to build a future was to honor the pattern of the present. As the sun finally broke through the mist, he sipped his tea, knowing that for the first time in 1,460 days, he was exactly where he was meant to be. This story teaches that no empire, no matter how powerful, can replace the value of human connection and responsibility. Kang Dae-hyun spent years building wealth, fear, and control, believing that dominance and technology could protect him, but he overlooked the people who truly mattered, the ones who quietly safeguarded his children and his home. Senna's courage and the invisible network show that real strength comes from empathy, loyalty, and selfless action, not intimidation or power. In this story, fatherhood is not about ownership or status. It is about presence, care, and consistency. Dae-hyun learns that showing up every day, paying attention to the needs of those who depend on him, and taking responsibility for their safety are the true markers of a man who can lead, protect, and redeem himself. Ultimately, this story demonstrates that ambition without compassion leaves a life hollow, while small acts of care, accountability, and love create a legacy far stronger than any throne, gun, or fortune.